Welcome to Seldom is Heard, a forum where folks at Thrive Kansas want to highlight the voices and issues that are seldom heard in the State House. Today we are talking with a few Kansas leaders about their work around statewide early child care and early childhood education. Now it's time to have our guests introduce themselves. What brought you today, and can you briefly describe your job and how long you've been there?
I'm Kamisha Sewell, and I'm the director of the Treehouse Early Education Foundation and the Treehouse Early Learning Center. And I'm director of both. The foundation itself is focused on early childhood education and helping Southeast Kansas families grow and reach their goals. So right now we're working on expanding our community navigation programs so that we can help more families, even if they're not part of the child care center. So we've been busy with that, and I'm here today to just help people understand better what it is we need in early childhood education and to advocate for the kids.
And I'm Julie Lyon, and I work economic development in rural and western Kansas. I'm a former mayor, a county commissioner-elect, and so I understand how policy and procedures affect and really impact communities. So in my work with economic development, childcare has been one of the top priorities, not anything that I would have expected it to be when I started, but have realized what an impact it does make in rural, especially communities.
Yeah, and my name's Logan Stensing, and I'm a policy coordinator with Thrive Kansas. And I'm not in an early childhood role, but I do a lot of advocacy for rural Kansas, especially within regards to childcare. I was hired with this aim and this mission of, hey, y'all, we've got a childcare crisis across our state. There are other areas where it feels as if family is not as supported as we could be. And so we do a lot of work connecting with Kansans across the state to talk to their legislators, talk to their policymakers about their values around early childhood and kind of the needs of our community, because that's, at the end of the day, so many of our rural communities are all struggling, kind of isolated. And so the work that we do is really trying to connect our rural communities together around shared needs and shared values.
And my name is Pampa Moyo, and I'm also a policy coordinator here at Thrive Kansas, and I will be your moderator today. Do you remember who provided childcare for you, and what do you remember?
I feel like I'm in a unique situation, but don't we all? We all have different family structures and stuff like that. So I was the oldest of six and grew up in a town of 100 people where my family, cousins and stuff like that made up like 22% of the entire town. So being that we already had a lot of kids, we were kind of the group where everybody gathered and stuff. And other than that, I don't really remember having childcare providers as like I think of them today. I remember going to my friend's mom's house and we played there, which now I realize as an adult, we were going to daycare, we just didn't know that that's what it was.
Yeah, I do remember I was pretty lucky. Growing up, I was able to go to my grandmother's house, and so a lot of the time I was there with her. There were a few times here and there where we had some after-school babysitters that, we went to their house for a little while, but it wasn't anything very long-term, so it was impactful. There were certain things that were impactful about it, but like I said, I was really lucky and got to be with my grandmother most of the time and got a lot of one-on-one attention, so I feel like that was, I was pretty lucky there.
Yeah, having parents that divorced when I was about 2 years old led to having two different kinds of childcare arrangements. On my dad's side, we had a home program, and so I remember I actually went to high school with the daughter of the mom who was my provider, and I remember there being a lot of different age ranges in that childcare program, which looking back, I think is a strength that program had, because I remember my perspective was like, oh, it's so cool that the older kids are talking to me. I feel so one with them. And now I'm looking back, thinking about how developmentally helpful that was to have those older kids in a setting where I was 3 or 4, and interacting. But then with my mom, we were actually in a center. It was like a faith-based Noah's Ark child care center where I still remember that teacher's name, Mrs. Melissa, and because she was my provider from like 3 to 5. And it's so interesting when you look back at early childhood, because other educators, in our life, we can maybe point to a thing we remember learning from them, or one little factoid or something. But my overall memory of her is one of like love and of positivity and of like someone that, and now she's like a professor at like Michigan State for early childhood education. So she was like kind of in the earlier days, I think, of really trying to learn about early childhood, and that it's a lot more than just babysitting, and there's so much more that goes into it. So those were kind of to both of my experiences. I felt very lucky to have that support system even across a split household.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
My most experience with early childhood is most of it was provided by my mom because she was a stay-at-home spouse. And then I also got into Head Start, and so I would go there around when I was 4. And my mom, because I'm a very young child, taught me how to read when I was 3. So when I got there, I would boss people around. I'm like, you sit down and I read to you. But I remember when I was like they were like testing people to see whether or not they fit, and they did a home visit, and I cared very little for the people coming to visit because it was my playtime. And so I remember like playing with my stuff and them talking to me and me being very annoyed, but then also knowing that like when I would go there, they were very warm and welcoming. And so I think a lot about that, and even though I don't have children, I think that they deserve to have spaces where like they get to be like mini annoying pimpos that like read to children and also get to be children, right? Get to be safe and have fun and learn and grow and develop.
I think it's interesting, or just across all 4 of our stories, it's so representative of the mixed delivery system that we have for childcare, that it's like we rely on what's closest, and often that's family. And if you have the option, like a Head Start is there for a community or for a family that needs it, and you have a home program for folks like my dad who maybe couldn't afford like a higher center cost. So yeah, it's just amazing that there's just this vast framework that we've had to depend on.
Yeah, I think now a lot of people kind of are missing out on being able to have that family support. So it's good to have the centers or in-home places that that they're getting quality care, and they're taken care of, even though they can't be with mom or grandma or whoever. Because and when we were growing up too, part of the time I was the child care because I'm the oldest of 4. So mom would work at night and my dad would work during the day, and I helped with the kids at night and did all the helping with homework and all that stuff quite a bit. So I think it's just nice that we can offer that variety of ways for families to get that care that they need.
Well, I find so often within childcare advocacy, there's this argument or assumption that if we're advocating for investments in early childhood and supporting the workforce and make sure there's slots available for families to have their kiddos in, that you don't believe kids should be with their families, or that families are somehow not a critical part of the social support system for that family. Like if we're investing in childcare, we must not care about like family time, which I think is completely false. And because it's not how people live their lives, it's not how we go day to day. So I don't know, that's something that popped out to me.
Each of us talked a bit about like our childhood experiences with early childcare and our time there. Could you also speak to how those experiences shaped you and how you view early childcare, just both back then and present day?
Sure. I think, like I mentioned before, I got a lot of one-on-one time, and I got to feel like I was loved and cared for, and I got read to one-on-one, and a lot of if I was with my siblings or cousins or whatever, we had activities and things that we always did, or just spending time with someone who makes you feel loved and cared for. And I think a lot of people who see, because we're an early learning center, and a lot of people who see that don't necessarily think of it as a warm and caring place, as more of just an educational place. But we try to create an environment where they feel warm and loved and cared about, so they feel safe to be able to learn and develop and learn new things. So I think that's a big part of what I think is important in early learning. I think that brain development and all the science that goes behind it is really important, but I think you still have to have that base of loving and caring, and making sure that you express that to the children and they can feel safe.
And thinking about the difference between back then and today, I think that's a significant difference because, growing up, I won't say communal because that sounds, interesting, but we did spend a lot of time at our friend's house, or we had our friends over there, and, we were fairly oblivious to money being exchanged. I remember the $2 an hour, was a thing, and I think it was for a long time, and it's strange because that has come up, and I think there's still some people of that generation that are like, why would you pay more than $2 an hour, for somebody to babysit? And it's so much more than that. But we had a lot of experiences with each other and working things out and knowing our community compared to today, where everybody's kind of in their own realm, in their own household, and there's a lot more rules and, oversight and stuff like that, which is good, but I don't feel like we know our families and communities as well as then. But I'm also probably a generation above, some of you guys.
Well, but I think like social
Yeah,
isolation,
yeah.
I mean, that's a
It's
huge,
grown a lot.
it's affecting all of
Yeah.
us, and we've,
Well, and as families move more, families get more spread out, and you don't have that village, because, they say it takes a village, but you don't have that anymore because you're disconnected from your biological family, and it can be hard, I think, with how busy we are to meet new people and make that new village, if you will, to help. So I think that it's become even more essential to have that childcare and that community sense of feeling at your child care center or home or wherever it may be.
well, and it makes me think about, this idea that neighborliness now means mind your business, right? And
Yeah.
and there's this toxic idea that, we as individuals need to stick to ourselves, and like, I don't want to teach you or tell you how to parent.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes our will to help and to be there for folks in our community can sometimes now be perceived as unwanted or potentially unasked for.
Nosy,
And
yeah.
it's like, and I think there's a fine line, right? Where, it would be amazing, and I wish we could, I think we're in this phase where we're trying to combat that disconnection we feel with each other in community, and so much of even our advocacy in this space, I think, is a statement to, because as someone that doesn't have kids, I look at this as, one, I value children, but I also know that this is a institution that supports people in my community, supports my neighbors, supports the businesses that thrive, or, could be on the brink of not thriving if they don't have the workers that can go in for childcare. Thinking about my early childhood experiences and how that shaped my view of the space, I think, growing up, when my parents separated, I was moving in and out of their house every month. Like, I would go to my mom's or dad's house, and this is like happening 2 through 4. And my mom, they lived in another state, so there was like interstate travel. So looking back, that was a very unstable situation to have a child navigating, especially when you're at the center of it. And the fact that, I still remember my Miss Melissa so well, and it's because she was there the whole time. And now I have words to put to what that was, and to your point, Tamisha, when you were talking about that love factor, I've been thinking about a report I read from like the American Society of Pediatricians, when they talked about children experiencing adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and how the number one thing we can do for children who are going through any type of adverse experience is to increase the safe, stable, and nurturing relationships in their lives. Which is it makes sense. Like, you're like, okay, cool, glad the scientists could put a name and words to love. But it tracks, and it makes so much sense. And just, growing up and seeing some of my like step nieces and nephews have maybe parents that weren't in the picture, and that idea that like we could be there for folks in that situation, I think that's inspired me in a lot of the work that I do.
Well, and you mentioned too, not having kids, but you still value children in your community, and that's me as well. I don't have kids, and people are always like, well, if you don't have kids, what are you doing in childcare? Because so many people come to childcare out of necessity for needing care for their own child, that they either start a childcare center or go work at a childcare center. And I don't have kids, but I'm on school board, and I'm on, and I'm on other boards and things because I care about the community as a whole, and I understand that even if you break it down in purely economic terms, you have to have childcare to have people go to work. And I think people miss that a lot, and they kind of don't get that. So it kind of bothers me when people are like, well, if you don't have kids, why do you care? I was like, well, I care about the whole community. I have to live there too, and they're going to be the ones taking care of us someday.
I wanted to know what motivated you to join early child care or to interact with it, and then why do you continue to stay in the early child care space?
I kind of came to it in a roundabout way. I started off, I was in art school for graphic design and interactive media, and I got to do some artwork with kids. And at the time I was kind of struggling because I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, and I was kind of thinking of changing my major. And I thought about art therapy with kids, and I thought about different things. And then somebody told me that there was a daycare that was hiring. So around that time, I was like, okay, I'll give this a try. And I loved it, and I got to do all this stuff, art stuff with the kids. And so I took what I learned there and was able to apply it to working with kids. And then I changed majors to early childhood education. So that's kind of how I came to it. But I've just always loved working with kids. I've always, even like I said, I'm the oldest out of 4, so I've taken care of kids since I was pretty young, and I've always enjoyed that. So I just kind of hit me that was kind of my calling, and that's what I'm really passionate about. Especially, I'm really interested in brain science, or neuroscience, and just what I've learned about brain development and how much of it happens 0 to 5. It baffles me that we aren't spending so much more time and money and effort on those first 5 years when they're at early learning centers.
90% of their brain develops from 0 to 5.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and so it blows my mind that more people, aren't as passionate about it as we are.
Well, and that's like pretty new science.
Yeah,
I mean, that's like
that's
science as of the last 15
Yeah.
years, and we're like learning more and more. So sometimes that kind of
A little time to catch up there.
Right. I think we're in this lull period where we've gone generations thinking, well, if they're not learning how to do math, and if they're not learning memory-based education,
What are they doing?
what are they doing? We're just keeping them safe, which is obviously a critical part of
Yeah,
childcare. Is
that's
keeping
step
the children,
one, but
is
step
keeping them
2
safe.
is social emotional,
Right.
and you're not getting sent home worksheets because that's not how they're learning at this stage.
Yeah.
Don't get me started on those.
I think, for me, one, I was really interested in high school. I wanted to actually go into law because I did like policy debate. I was very argumentative. I thought this is my skill set. And so I got an internship with the juvenile court system in Sedgwick County. So I worked under like the DA. I was like a junior in high school, so I was 16. And I just sat in this courtroom and watched kids my age and younger go through the system, right? And that was an extremely difficult experience, but it wasn't difficult for me. I just kept thinking, like, why am I on this side? Why am I the kid that's in the internship? And why is that kid being put through a system that I don't really feel like is adequately caring for them, or it feels like it's too late? Like, obviously it's never too late, but like, all I kept thinking was like, man, and that was like, I was like thinking about going into law. So I was like, well, how I don't feel like I'm helping this kid in this moment. And there's people who are public defenders do that work. That's critical. But I was like, if I could find something where it felt like I was getting at a root cause, like if I felt like I'm like, go farther back. And so I feel so blessed that early childhood advocacy kind of found me in that way. Like, I didn't even seek out this work. I didn't make the math of like, well, based on my internship experience, I should work in early childhood. It really just, I saw a job and that opportunity. And then when I made that mental connection, I was like, goodness, this is so critical for our future. And it also feels, and I also, my grandma was an early childhood provider in El Dorado. She worked at First Baptist Daycare, and that was an institution that was in our community for 60 years, and they closed down a couple years ago, all because of workforce. They couldn't hire enough people because people weren't willing to get paid the wages that they were paying to do that critical work. And when my grandma worked there, she was making $2-3 an hour, whatever the minimum wage was in the 80s at the time, and we're not far off the minimum wage for many settings. And so that's, I think, what drives me a lot is those prior experiences
Yeah,
there.
definitely. And I think that the pay that you mentioned is still a big issue. Like even with places that are nonprofit and grant funded and things, like you have to worry from day to day, what if we don't get this next grant and we have, how are we going to afford to pay people enough? Because childcare is expensive. We all know childcare is expensive. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is where all that money goes, to all the overhead costs and how much you have to pay staff. And I think that they think we're out there just making all this money because it costs them so much, but so much goes back into it.
I mean, my experience is a little different. I came into early childhood work, I guess, not kicking and screaming, but it wasn't anything that I wanted to deal with. Growing up in a town of 100, like I said, I generally work for communities of 1,000 or less, because I feel like those are the ones that don't have anybody else working for them. And so that was important to me. Now, when I was recruited, they said, we need help out here. We all know that population in rural Kansas, population loss is a huge thing. And so to combat that, we need to recruit more people. We need to recruit more businesses. We need to recruit families. Okay, so where do you start? And that was one of my challenges, was like, well, we need workforce, but if we need to attract workforce, we need housing. If we don't have houses where families can move to, we're not going to attract them. And if they do move here and get a job and they don't have childcare, they're not going to work. So it was this very cyclical issue, and childcare was a major part of that. So I basically, went on the approach of, if we have too many daycare slots in our county, which would probably never happen, but we're getting close, because we have made strides. But if we had too many daycare slots or too many daycare providers, we would be able to recruit families if we had housing, and it's one of those things. People will move. And I've seen it. I've seen people relocate because they can't find childcare. So if they will move out of a community because there's not childcare, they will move to a community because there is. And so that was one of the top priorities. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to make strides in local and small towns in western Kansas because of that understanding.
I mean, that's what so much of our, with Thrive Kansas's mission around rural revitalization and how do we help our communities get to a place of thriving. And so much of it, I mean, you just, I think, so eloquently put that in, you encapsulated the conversations we have across rural. And that's, again, why we're so excited for this conversation and having, because I imagine your perspective is not unique to, even Northwest Kansas and Southwest Kansas and Northeast, the corner, every rural pocket of our state has these struggles right now. And it's about how can we talk to each other and kind of create that shared sense of, all right, y'all, well, we're struggling, you're struggling. How can we get to a place where we're all not doing that? But yeah. So I did want to answer this one.
Okay, we'll ask that
I
question.
love this one.
Just for you. What is your favorite part of being with children during the early childhood years? Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. You forced it out of me. No, I think so. This is, for me, an aspect that I love of early childhood is the idea of inspiring awe in children. I love when children feel safe and are secure and can experience life to the fullest that they can. Because I think those moments where, one thing that we do at Thrive is we'll take kids out to the trails and we'll do like some nature-based learning, and it's just how curious they are. I think I relate to that a lot. Like, I'm a very curious person. I'm also very silly, and so being able to be with children in a space where there's folks who keep them safe, and they're keeping them in a place where they can enjoy being a child. And I think that's what I love being a part of. And I don't know if I'm necessarily built to be an early childhood educator, because I enjoy all of the fun parts of being with the kids. So unlike Tamisha, who carries the responsibility of all of the caregiving aspects, which include the parts that are not so glamorous, right? So I get to be fun, and I get to pick my times that I work with the kids. But it's again that realization that I couldn't have that fun and that joy and that silliness with them if those children didn't have safe, stable, nurturing people in their lives. So I think that's one of my favorite things about kids. And awe, like that whole awe, like the idea that they like, just when you share
So
something
much
that
more is so like amazing to them,
yes,
there's actually two things about being where I am now in early childhood education as a director. I love that I still get to be in the classroom. Sometimes, even when I'm kind of busy and trying to do other things, I get to stop and be in the classroom still, which is nice, because then I get to see these kids develop and grow and learn new things. And like you said, that sense of awe. And I love watching my teachers get excited about their lesson plans with the kids, and then watching the kids get excited and do those things and see what they're learning. And, we take a lot of pictures and video and stuff, and so I can share that with families. And then the other thing that I enjoy about where I am is I also get to work with the families. I get to help develop our sense of community within the daycare itself, and I get to help with our community navigator program, where basically we have a resource list compiled for everything in Southeast Kansas and federal level, where families can get some sort of assistance. So whether that's WIC or LEAP for heating, or not food stamps. SNAP. Thank you. I can't think of the word SNAP. But things like that. And then, of course, local charities that have like clothing donations that they do. We have some clothing donations. But anyway, we get to help parents get those things that could help them reach their goals. So, like, I get to watch the parents, who go and take a parenting class that we tell them about that's free, come back and say, oh my gosh, we tried this and it's really working and it's helping. And it helps the whole family, not just the child with the behaviors or whatever the case may be. It helps all of them. So I think getting to work with the families and the community and watch the children and families grow is really cool, because I felt like I got to do that some when I was an in-home provider, but now I'm in contact with so many more families that it's even more noticeable to me to see those families grow and reach their goals and things.
Going more into the topic of like early childcare, what are some factors that make for quality childcare?
Well, there's a lot that goes into quality childcare, and a lot of that, or my biggest thing that I found, is quality staff, is having the workforce who's knowledgeable or is able to be trained well enough to do the job and be able to provide that quality care and in a safe environment. You kind of have to start basically with the hierarchy of needs. You have to make sure, that the location is safe. It's in a good, not just in a good location as far as like convenience wise, but it's a safe area. You want, as safe as you can be, and you can have your outdoor space safe, indoor space, all of that, super base level stuff. But then you also have to have, on top of that, you have to have the educational aspect, the development aspect. I think a big part of that is doing things like developmental assessments, like the ages and stages questionnaires. They're non-invasive, not, like you mentioned, you had the Head Start people come and you were trying to play, and they were talking at you. Well, you don't want to do that, necessarily. But so, anyway, keeping track of where the children are and where they could be for their age, and what they kind of tailoring what you're doing as a teacher to what your class needs. So I think if you're say you're at a daycare and you hear them say they work with what their class needs, what their kids' needs are developmentally, then I think, you're probably in pretty good hands there because they know what they're doing. But I think it all comes back to the people who do the work have to love what they do and love being there for the kids and show the kids that they're loved. So I think it kind of all comes back to that base level of being safe and loved, and then on top of that, the extra learning and care and development from there.
I love that we all have different perspectives, because I think, and it ties into the earlier questions, I think stability is such a big deal and lacking in so many families these days. And so having a daycare provider that can provide stability in a time of chaos, maybe,
Definitely.
daycare could become a refuge, and that's why they love it, and they bond with the teacher and things like that. So, in my role, it's different. My work is to support the daycare provider, who will then in turn support the kids.
Yeah.
And so I think if I can help them, I just want people to show up and love kids. And I've said that from the beginning. I can help you
absolutely.
with everything else, because so often we find daycare providers are not trained in business management. They don't know how to do their taxes. Like, there's a lot that goes into it. And so if I can be support for them, then that just takes away, it alleviates a lot of the stress and pressure, and they are able to just focus on the kids. And then we can work on the other stuff later. So if I support the provider can do their job better.
Exactly, and that helps so much with burnout. Like, I have working by myself, especially when I was in family child care, burnout was a real problem. And then we started getting more resources from grants and things where we could get more business specific training, on business aspects of everything, which I was fairly good with anyway, but they really helped polish it and, get to a better place with it. And I think that took a lot off of me, and even now that's still helping a lot, because I'm running the show now, I guess you would say, and having that background and having, people like you to be able to help get to that place is super important for providers.
Well, even if parents aren't working and still need daycare, I think that's because, being a full-time parent is hard. Like,
Oh my God,
everything is hard these days, but having that, being able to send your kid to daycare so you can catch up on life and things that need to be done is important. But also, for the provider, and even just this morning I got a phone call because I have a substitute program, and that sub is only coming so they can go and do groceries. And she said, you have no idea how big of a deal it is that I can do my grocery shopping during daycare hours and not have to worry about the kids being taken care of, and that frees up so much time on my weekend that it is incredible. And so
they get to spend that time with their kids and stuff.
to hear that feedback is really crucial for me to make me keep doing what I do.
Well, in the pattern, I would say, with both of your responses, with quality care coming from people that love children, and that love drives their intention. It drives, if you really do love them, you think about, well, how can I improve my setting to be the best? And so many of the providers I've met across so many different types, from faith-based home providers, centers, even unlicensed care, and I think that's like sometimes when that quality conversation gets brought up, it gets this debate between licensed and unlicensed care. And, the point being that licensed care, with the regulations that it comes with, and there's, debate of those, and we've tried to streamline a lot of processes, is this idea that there is a built-in intention with those kinds of programs. But there being a lot of unlicensed folks who do love children still, like they do care for children as well.
A lot of them don't even know where to start.
And they don't even,
license.
exactly, like I think that's, one of the things I wanted to flesh out was just the idea that sometimes I think when we're investing in early childhood, or supporting, like, what are the right programs, and I think that debate comes up, and it creates a lot of division in the field of early childhood, And when really, I think what's been beautiful about Kansas's approach as of late has really been trying to embrace that we are a mixed delivery system, that we have all these different types of providers and folks who, if you love children, there's a pathway for you to improve your professional development, and you are supported to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the struggles we have right now is, do they feel that support? Does this feel like a career that they can invest in to improve in and
Well,
be quality?
and I think too, to the fact that you have to love children, there is the downside of people see it as, well, you do it because you love children. You do it because you love children, you shouldn't be, you're not in it for the money. Why are you worried about, daycare is already so expensive. Why do you want more? Not understanding, what our wages actually are like. But I think it comes back to, it's kind of one of those things that's considered women's work, and then therefore is seen kind of as either not that it doesn't seem like a necessity, but people just think that we should be doing it for the love of doing it, and not to sustain ourselves and our families. So I think it's important to remember that yes, we do it because we love children, but we have to take care of ourselves too, or there's nobody to take care of the kids.
And a lot of that quality. Oh, sorry, Julie. I was just going to say that, building off what you were saying about it being more than just loving children, I think it was kind of how you both were talking about this idea that foundationally we love children, but there's so many skill sets and training and expertise that goes into caring for strangers' children. Because I think that's the other element of this as well, is that, you may feel the pressure, and I don't know the pressure of having my own children, but like the idea that you are caring for another family's child, and that also when the child is 1 year old, that's the most vulnerable time in that child's entire existence. I think that impresses upon them that, like, okay, y'all, well, we can love children, but also that love should drive us for quality and to learn and to create a space and an environment that is truly nourishing them, that's aligned with science. And that's kind of going back to our previous thing of we've just learned so much about what quality means and what the impact of quality is. And I think that's the part that is so fascinating to me as someone that's very invested in our future and thinking of the ways in which so much of our approach to societal problems feels retroactive. Like we're trying to help folks when they're dealing with substance abuse as adults, or mental health challenges as adults, or incarceration problems because they have certain behaviors, and thinking like, y'all, wow, quality childcare could actually have, and really has been illustrated.
There's a reason they call things
yes.
the preschool to prison pipeline, because these kids are getting expelled as early as preschool, and it does not go well for the rest of their time, and they end up, it just makes such a huge difference having that care, and no matter what, the situation, it's huge.
Thinking from the policy and procedure aspect of this, because what you just said made me think, we do have unlicensed providers out there, and I think there's a misconception that, they hear, oh, well, there's all this regulation, oh, there's so many rules, and there are, but it's all manageable. But if you don't know how to navigate that system, and you don't have anybody showing you how to do that or helping you along the way, it's intimidating.
Absolutely.
It's not impossible, it's not hard, it's just intimidating. So having somebody to kind of walk you through, here's what you do, here's who you contact, let me help you and put you in touch with, having that support and kind of hand-holding doesn't cost anything. So,
Yeah. And I think that has definitely improved over the years. I know when I first started, I was trying to find information from all these different locations on, how do I get a hold of the fire marshal? How do I get a hold of the city? Who do I need to talk to here and there? And now I've seen, especially I think it was Child Care Aware, came to Independence and hosted a thing for people who are interested in possibly becoming child care providers. And they would do exactly that. They would help them. They would even give them incentives. If you start getting this and that done, then, you could get things for your business like a printer or whatever, depending on what you needed as far as to get started and get going. And they would actually kind of hold your hand and help you get through that. And so I think I'm seeing that improve. I think it would be nice if something was all in one location online for the entire state, This is what you need to do. These are and there's regulations, but they're not online, but they're not necessarily in plain English sometimes, and you have to kind of decipher that a little bit.
And if I can just say what needs to be said is at the state level, there's the different groups that license childcare that do work together.
Yes,
And
yeah.
you may have the fire marshal doing one thing and, KDHE doing another, and they're not on the same path.
No.
With it could be consolidated or have a line of communication between those things would be much better.
And to our listeners, I know that and both of our leaders today have been involved in this work around the Office of Early Childhood, which was this idea that aligns directly with what we're talking about, which was trying to consolidate all of our agencies that are serving early childhood populations, but right now are spread about 4 to 5 different state agencies. So that got stalled last legislative session, but there is movement and support behind the idea because of the points you're bringing up right now.
Yeah.
So
That's kind of exactly what we need.
literally, yeah.
I just think if we're going to be having and wanting legislators to hear this, and they need to understand.
They need to. Well, and I think it helps to have a well-rounded conversation, because a lot of our policymakers want to tackle the low-hanging fruit. They're like, all right, I hear, because a lot of times providers, because there's such a lack of support and there's a lack of a systems-wide approach to helping them, sometimes their most interaction with government and community is the regulations, right? Like that's the closest,
100%.
right? That's
Regulations and taxes.
they hear from their right, and they hear from their child care surveyor, and then there's this maybe this kind of police-like mindset and relationship, which I know they've been trying to work on within KDHE, but it's a challenge, and I think it doesn't help for us as advocates to ignore that, right? Like we have to recognize, there's some real substance here, but we can't, because I think my frustration comes from when we use that fixation on regulation to completely not talk about, well, what about sustainable funding for early childhood? Looking at all these other states across the country who are making massive investments in early childhood because they are experiencing the same exact struggles that we are. They have the same science. They have the same, babies don't develop different in Massachusetts as they do in Kansas, right? But it's this mindset that we've gotten very used to, this way of doing things. And, I think about it a lot with what you said, Tamisha, about people viewing it as women's work. And I think that's another thing that drives me to this work is, as a man, I find it very disrespectful that this work that is put on the backs of people who care for children, who are, to me, just model public servants because they're being underpaid. They're doing basically the Lord's work, charity work, that should not be valued like that. And to think that what's contributing to that lack of support is this idea that, well, they're women. They're maybe naturally built to be caregivers. They don't really need funding to think of this as a career. This is maybe just a hobby. It's
just a backup to their husband's income.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
That doesn't get me started.
I've heard that several times, and to me, we've now gotten to a point, especially within the current generation. I have friends that are my age. I'm 26, that have been in early childhood for years and live with their parents. They can't afford to grow as within their career, but they love it. They love this field, and to feel like there's a disconnect between the value that is provided within early childhood and childcare and the value returned to them.
Yeah, and I think part of, the part with, like you said, the only interaction with government is probably licensing and regulations. I think that maybe if people felt like, or providers specifically felt like someone was actually listening when they tried to tell them what would help us, I think maybe that would get them more interested in advocacy. Because, for example, I was really surprised when we had the recent election, and I told my employees, if you haven't voted yet, I'll go to your classroom and be in your classroom so you can go vote. And they were like, really? They hadn't, thought about it. And I'm like, yeah, because here are these issues, local stuff matters too, and kind of talked to them a little bit about that. I actually had a few of them who voted for the first time because I explained to them how it would make a difference. And so they heard from somebody else who understood, this is the problems we're seeing. These are the people that are going to change or not change it, kind of thing. So I think if people feel heard, they're more likely to try and get involved in advocacy, and maybe then our representatives could possibly listen and realize that it's not, what's going to make the biggest difference isn't making like higher ratios where children are less safe. Because in my opinion, that's all you're doing, is you're increasing the number of children that you can have in a space, but those ratios are there for a reason. They're there for safety reasons. And I understand they're trying to fix the issue. I just think they're not listening to providers on how to fix that issue. Because as a provider, I have not changed my ratios at all. Because for one, it's kind of a moot point if you have, because you have to have so many square feet per child inside and outside. So we're already at our max. Like we can't make an adjustment anyway because of the size of the building and everything. So, sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. But
I love the different aspects and the different perspectives of this,
Yeah.
because I think you and I probably think of childcare in completely different ways. You're thinking from the director's position,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking from the leadership position. My job is to help bring the weight of that fruit and drop that branch so it is low-hanging fruit.
yeah, exactly.
And so when I was mayor, I would so often talk about, we have to have a plan in place. Nobody's going to come and help us. But I love elections so much. Like, they're my favorite thing. And I understand that, and I love the of the people part, right? So just normal people can make an impact in their community. And I think you can have, the best truck driver, the best tire guy. They're really good at what they do, but they are not trained in municipal finance or municipal budgeting or HR matters, and so there's a learning curve. And so if those of us that are in the trenches and doing the work and understand the problems can professionally and clearly express what the issues are to those who maybe have just got elected this year, and they're coming to the State House uneducated on a lot of things, and they're going to be hit with, the hardcore, this is how things in Topeka work, and trying to catch up and attend luncheons and do all that stuff. They're not necessarily trained in childcare, but they need to understand that it's important and this is why. So our job is to communicate that to them and help educate them.
One, oh my goodness. So much of what y'all are saying, I feel, is very tied to like my why and my mission, in that there's this really very large challenge within early childhood advocacy where much of the weight of that advocacy has been put on early childhood educators themselves, right? It's like, hey y'all, if you want money, if you want funding, hey, go to the State House. Well, are you running a program? Are you, and there's this disconnect where we don't understand how hard it is in the daily life of a child care program. And the idea, I guess, is just that there are so many people in community, like myself, and folks who maybe don't even have kids. Maybe you do have kids. Anybody, if you look at these folks and if you meet them, if you connect with them, I think you will be inspired. You will see a part of, like, I always say, because my grandma was in childcare, I feel like part of my grandma's love I see in people. And I'm like, when I feel that, and like that, my sense of protection and being like, gosh, guys, they're barely able to advocate for themselves within this current structure. So what else are we doing, to your point, Julie, as community members to see that? Because, we have Child Care Appreciation Month, and sure, it's nice to post an appreciation, picture or what have you, but truly, if we want to show that we appreciate them, it takes our voice and our exactly. And
But not just the voice,
Yeah.
but a clear voice.
Yes,
And this
yes.
is where,
Definitely.
I've had people say, we just need men to go to the state. We need to get 100 men and dress them, and make them hold the babies. And I'm like, you don't have to make them, just,
Well, like, first of all,
Like-
that just sounds weird,
but like,
Guess I'll go.
what exactly, if we had, 500 dads carrying their kids and wearing the same t-shirt, march to the Capitol, what are they asking for? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it has to be a clear
yeah,
ask.
like direct action is great if you have something, to go with it. Like, we're doing this thing because we want X, Y, and Z.
But that's
you
where I
know?
think you have
And
been.
that's where, advocates come in, because it's like you were saying, we're trying to run a daycare business all day. Like, it was hard enough for me to get the time to come up here. How am I supposed to go to the Capitol? And I try, and I do. I'm very lucky that I can do that from time to time. But I know most providers, there's no way they can do that. Like, they have to be in ratio, so they can't just let somebody leave to go do it, because they have to meet those ratios, because obviously
But people like
necessary.
you that have been working with childcare, providers and doing this policy work, understand where some of the major issues are. So if we can have, the newly elected or the ones that have heard that childcare is an issue but don't really understand, be the voice of, this is how we're going, this is what we need. I think that makes a huge difference. And I'm thinking about Elkhart, Kansas, where I went out there and they have one childcare provider for the entire area, and it's so vast out there. And for them to drive to Topeka is like 6+ hours, and you're not going to have your one childcare provider leave and drive
Yeah.
3/4
Leave
way
your
across
entire
the
town
state
there, yeah.
to go and maybe get an appointment. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't
And when
even,
you-
it doesn't
And
even work.
From firsthand experience, it's not a long meeting, and sometimes it can feel like you're just talking at them. So, what I mean is, it takes more than one visit, I think, to make an impact. But we need, like you were saying, we need advocates like you guys who can kind of bridge that gap between, us and what we need, and then what they see and understand.
Well, that's what I love about civic engagement. And to your point, I love, because I also, that of the people part of our democracy, right, is so, I often, when I go to communities where we have these conversations, I'll show them a picture of the quote that's in the Capitol, or it's in the basement area, where it says, the power is inherent in the people. And that's in our Bill of Rights. And I always say it, and I'm like, hey, y'all, do we feel that powerful, though? Right? Because it says in our Constitution that all the power is derived from us. But if you talk to the everyday Kansan and you talk about their values, and do they feel reflected in government? Do they feel powerful enough to stand up for those values, to shape policy, to shape law, to shape systems? You ask that question to most people, they're saying no. And that's the problem, I think, and where we're trying to galvanize people, not only around the problems, but I think the part, tying back to what we love about children and everything is, and especially with my perspective as kind of a younger professional, wading into a space where people have been leaders in it for decades. I mean, we had a sign-on letter circulated last year where we were advocating for investments in early childhood, as well as the Office of Early Childhood. We had thousands of folks sign on, a lot of them early childhood folks, and we asked them, how long had you been in early childhood? And we had over 5,000 years of early childhood experience represented in support of these causes. That's baffling. I mean, I had anecdotally heard how long, I'll talk to a provider and she's like, I've been in this for 2 decades. I've been in this for 3 decades. I've been in this for 15. I'm like, wow, they're really in this field for a long time. But to then see the absolute just vast knowledge base and wisdom and earned wisdom, that's not just certificates from online school.
Right.
That's you're talking about decades of in the
Experience,
trenches,
yeah.
people that, I just my mind explodes
I still
thinking
learn-
of the effects those people have had on our
Yeah.
state.
And I still learn all the time, and I've been doing it for 15 years,
Yeah.
so can you imagine?
Goodness. So I say that because to your point about not feeling like they're listened to, we have these professionals across our state that, I mean, are experts, and and no milling around, no what if to that, and it doesn't feel like we listen to them when the truth is not what we want to hear, and that's got to stop. We have to, and that applies to so many political issues across the spectrum, is really just hearing what we want to hear selectively. And I think so much of what we're trying to do is recognize, y'all, sure, we've had generations where this has been how it's been, but also looking at right now is just this monumental opportunity. I mean, again, that's why I feel so blessed to be an advocate and to work alongside people, or like when the work gets hard as an advocate, because we got to talk to legislators and love them, and God bless their public service, but a lot of times it's very frustrating, and it can be very stressful when it feels like you're so invested in the cause, and you're so wanting to serve the people that we're fighting for. That stress can be a lot, and every time I've ever thought about quitting or whatever, I think, oh, are the early childhood folks doing that? Seems like they keep going to work. And I mean, obviously, and I'm not saying anyone, to folks who've gotten burnt out, who have left, I understand. So it's not trying to make them feel bad, but just the idea that there's just these public servants in our communities who have invested so much. I think it's time for the rest of our community to recognize that service and think about how can we be building alongside them.
On the topic of the frustration of talking to legislators, whether it's feeling like you're talking at them or that they don't understand, I think that also extends to the general public, right? Of like, sure, like I understand what daycare is and I understand what like a home provider is in theory, but what are some things that people just don't understand about early childhood, that don't have children, and like why should they care about this topic?
One aspect, and we kind of talked about this related to the effects of early childhood, and especially if you start getting into like the science of it, and Tamisha, you could speak to this at much greater detail. But one of the, just if you're going to zero in on one of the aspects of early childhood development, I find so ripe with opportunity is social emotional regulation and health. And I think that social emotional regulation ties so much to our mental health, to how we behave on a daily basis, how we navigate conflict, how we navigate adversity, which is something that happens every single day of our lives. And I think about how I was raised, with a conservative mindset, and from a household where we were really instilled to be self-reliant and to be independent, and be with your community, you have people to lean on, but how can we set you up to be the most successful person possible? And that realization that, like, wow, y'all, that early childhood has so much to affect, like, to impact how these kids process their emotions, and the amount of science that has been explored in the last 2 decades for just how to facilitate conversations with children and just ask them questions. Like, it's not super complicated, but it's stuff that we haven't really ever been integrating on a systems-wide approach. Like, it's really novel, I think, as of our generation, which is exciting because we have this newfound knowledge and information. And I think just looking across our society and our communities, if we were just better at regulating our emotions, holy moly. And that feels like a very large goal to achieve, but it's, I mean, how much money do we spend retroactively on these problems compared to earlier on?
Well, and not just mentally, but I think that question goes back to family and family time. And if you are trying to, it does tie back to mental health. So I use real life examples because that's what I know best. Yeah. And I always speak to rural because that's also what I know best. And so if I have a family that lives 22 miles from the nearest daycare provider, and they drive 22 miles before work and then 22 miles after work, and it's the opposite way, I can even think, and I'll just say in Protection, Kansas, there is no daycare. The closest one is 18 miles away, and it's either to Ashland or to Coldwater. And so if they leave Protection and have to drive 18 miles to one way or the other, and then 18 back to go to work in their own town, and then do that. You're talking over an hour of your day. And so when you think about quality of life, if they had childcare in their town where they went 1 or 2 minutes, and then 1 or 2 minutes, that gives them a whole lot of time to make them not only safer because they're not on the road, but to spend quality time with their family or doing things that they like. And if they're able to have an extra hour a day to spend on a hobby or family or something like that, that's going to be better for their mental stability.
Often sorry, I was going to say, building off what you just shared, one of the arguments, because as someone that doesn't have kids, often I'll be confronted with this conversation as I'm peddling early childhood advocacy, trying to recruit people. They'll be like, well, I don't have kids at that age range, kind of to your point, Tempo. And my first statement is like, well, do you use or do you enjoy any organizations or businesses in your community? Do you use the hospital? Would you like the fire department to be there? Do you like the police? If you do, you like childcare, because that is infrastructure. Like there's so many workers at all those institutions that rely, to the point of the folks that were traveling from protection. That worker was serving people. They were providing a labor and a service, and a valuable one at that, to their community that they wouldn't be able to otherwise if they didn't have childcare. So I always make it that almost like a childcare as infrastructure. We have this really cool banner where we have early childhood folks holding up the world, and it says like early childhood education is our foundation, and it's so accurate. And I think that is a different image than we have as just like, ooh, childcare is lovey-dovey. It's just such a kind thing.
If I could also just speak to the economic impact, and I will use protection as an example because it's what I know best, and I think it relates to a lot of different towns. But they have a nursing facility, a nursing home in protection that employs people, and those people that live in those towns in protection work at that nursing home. If that nursing home were to close because they can't find workers, because they can't find childcare, then all the people that are in the nursing home will move out of county because there is nowhere else. And so you lose all of those dollars, all of those jobs. Then you have a vacant building that is too big, can't be regulated. There's just so much economic downspin that goes with that. So childcare kind of has a finger in one of the plugs, holding everything together. So it could be out of balance at any time, if that were to close. But I'm excited because I see that there's a path and there's opportunity right now that we've not had previously because of legislation, because of some good decisions and funding applied towards childhood, or early childhood education, that now there's the possibility, that protection will have its own daycare and Coldwater will not lose any of its daycare. And so we're adding, not only daycare slots, but then that builds stability for employers and so on. So it's just good for a healthy community.
Yeah, and my answer is kind of along the same lines, is that childcare is infrastructure is one thing that people don't understand. And for a little while there, during COVID, it seemed like people started to understand that. Because we were open, we were there so first responders could go to work, we were there so doctors and, so that everybody else could go to work, we were open, regardless of how crazy it got, we were there and we were celebrated during that time, but it seems like since then, everybody's kind of forgotten a little bit and and that the same can be said for the appreciation of doctors and the appreciation of grocery store workers and things like that, because we're all tired. I get it, but I, like you said, childcare just is infrastructure, and I don't think enough people understand that it's not just where you go put your kids and go do your thing. It's important for the rest of their lives and for our economy, and for something that important to not be considered infrastructure, it just doesn't make sense.
I do kind of want to talk a little bit about both of you. I know personally as early childhood champions that have built amazing things in your community, and that was made possible by funding often in grants. So I would love to just learn a little bit more about what kind of resources were you able to tap in for your community? Has that been sustained? And where could there be better opportunities? So I guess if you could speak to that, that'd be very interesting.
Oh boy. So yeah, my journey with funding has been really interesting and really up and down. When I very first started, so I bought the building in February of 2020. So that was a heck of a time to buy a building for a daycare. And during that time, we were an LLC at first, because I didn't know a whole lot about nonprofits, and I had always been told it was a lot of work to get one going and, maybe not worthwhile. Well, come to find out it's definitely worthwhile because there's a lot of funding you can't get if you're not nonprofit. Excuse me. So it kind of is set up in a kind of a funny way. We have an LLC that owns the building, and then we have the nonprofit in the building. And because of the nonprofit being in the building, we were able to use some of the funding that we received on the building. But a lot of the funding that we did receive, we could not use on construction. And that was a big issue through the whole, I'd say we worked on it for 4 years, and that's after years of planning in advance. And we went through, like I mentioned, we went through all these different channels. We went to the fire marshal's office, we had architects, we had so many people we had to figure out who to talk to and all this. And, even when we talked to the fire marshal in advance about some concerns we had with the building, we still ended up finding more that we were going to have to do and adding on hundreds and thousands of dollars, just one thing right after another, just bam, bam, we need a whole new AC unit, we need a whole, we had to add a door to every classroom and all this other. Point is, lots of stuff came up, and we almost didn't make it, but then COVID happened, of course, and the interesting thing is that ended up helping us, because I honestly don't know that we would have been able to do it without the increase in grant funding that we got because of COVID. We got the PPP loan. That did kind of make where we were difficult because we were in the process of actually getting a business loan. So they had to put that on hold to process all the PPP loans, which we did get, but then I had to basically redo all of the paperwork for any kind of business loans, which if you've ever done a business loan paperwork, that is a lot of paperwork. Had to redo all of that, but then we started getting these grants in, and we were able to use that to either do the stuff to the building or buy the stuff that was going to go into the building so that we could afford to do the stuff to the building. But I think one of the biggest things that I learned was that it is definitely worth it right now as it stands to become a nonprofit, because so much of the funds that you can receive, you have to be nonprofit to be, or have somebody who is a nonprofit as your financial sponsor or all this other stuff. And while I understand the need, the want for places to be nonprofit, it comes back to providers not understand, like providers aren't going to know how to start a nonprofit. Like not everyone's going to be crazy enough to learn it on their own, while working at another nonprofit, kind of thing like I did. And actually that comes back to the funding. When I worked here, it was because I was running the daycare out of my home, and I had to start paying on the loans for the building before we were able to open the building, because originally it was worked out to where we'd open the center, we'd fill up, and that money would be used to pay the loans, like a normal business loan. But that didn't happen, obviously. So I worked a second job here to actually pay the loan for the building while we finished working on the building. So that's how I improved, because I had already written some grants before, but doing it professionally improves quite a bit. So being able to do that has been a great asset to me. But I think it, like I said, it comes back to not everybody knows how to do that, to write those grants, because not all the grants I've received were from the state, and ones that everybody knows about. They're ones that I researched and dug and found, and on other places. So we need the funding, but we need some other way to do it than grant writing, because most people don't have a grant writer. Most people, we need some kind of steady funding to back us up.
Was you made those big purchases, and then you're
Yeah.
banking on
Yeah.
the idea of getting a competitive grant.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Well, and right now, I'm in the process of writing another competitive grant that will help cover a lot of our costs and make it possible for me to continue to pay my staff a decent wage, better than what's, minimum wage in the area, and to be able to do things like we offer PTO, we offer health insurance and life insurance and things like that. But without this grant, I don't know what we would do. We would have to cut back on staff, we would have to cut back on rooms we had. There's just so much that we'd have to cut back on to be able to get through that, it all starts to fall apart if you're not, because I do fundraising, but in a small town, there's only so much fundraising you can do, So we try to keep up on fundraising, but at the same time, it makes it hard for us to be able to do that. And a lot of people aren't going to want to come into a job where they have to worry about whether they wrote a satisfactory grant to keep their funding. They want a business that they know is going to keep going,
Well, and something just to flesh out for our listeners, I think, is this idea of where the lines of funding come from for a child care program, and like what are the reliable funds, or what are the streams that are always flowing.
Yeah.
And really the only ones are parents
Yeah.
paying in the fees.
Exactly.
And sometimes the child care subsidy if they have access to
Yeah.
it. But I can imagine you can speak to this as well, of that right now, if parents think the cost of child care is expensive now, they currently, the vast majority of providers are not charging what the cost of quality care provide, or what that actual cost is. They're currently, the average price is deflated, so parents can afford it. Because if you were charged
more, then
Yeah.
parents would be able to afford it.
can you
That's the
imagine?
whole-
Could you guesstimate how much you would potentially charge a week if you were to try to pay?
Oh God, I don't even.
Right.
What do you charge now?
So right now for infants, it's $160 a week, and I know people in larger cities are going to hear that and think, oh, that's nothing, but for independents, that's a lot. But we charge $160, and then it goes down to $140 for toddlers, and then $130, and then $125 for our preschool and pre-K, which is another thing that we offer that not all centers do, because we are, like we said, a learning center. But yeah, so just the idea of charging what we should be, I see all the time on child care provider and director things, they get tired of hearing people complain about how expensive it is, and at the same time, there's always that, well, if we charged you what either a nanny would charge you, if we charged you $10 an hour per child, you're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. If we charged you anywhere close to, like what you said, for high quality care, you wouldn't be able to afford it. So it comes back to, we do it because we love it, so we bring the prices down.
Yeah. I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's really important to show the full picture from the provider perspective in the program, like as a business, and the fact that you have taken on all that work of finding additional funding for your program because you're trying to care for your families.
Yeah.
Because you see that you can't put it on their backs.
Yeah, I
And
can't charge them.
exactly.
more.
So I think, to me, that's such an important clarification, because like you've even pointed at the beginning, because there's sometimes this disconnect between parents and programs and not understanding, well, where's the money going? And
Like, you see all this food they eat. Do you have any idea how much children eat? Like, oh my.
Well, and I think there's a big difference between her as a center and the work that I do. So
Yeah.
in rural communities, there's just no way that it makes sense to do a center. And so I always say, if you have trouble hiring teachers or nurses or anything, you are not big enough to have a center. And being that I work in very small communities, it makes the most sense to do in-home
Yeah.
providers. And Also, a lot of people don't want to do in-home daycare in their home because there's
They
no
want to be
separation,
there.
and it leads to higher burnout. So I have taken the approach and have set up and basically created turnkey facilities in commercial buildings, and then we license them as in-home providers in a commercial setting. I've been able to do that at a far less dollar amount than it costs to build a center, operate a center, or any of that. So I think childcare without subsidies is almost like it's just
Yeah,
really
it's
hard.
not.
But I'm subsidizing them at about $1,000 a kid versus $10,000 a kid, And while doing that, have been able to work towards a more sustainable way to provide that. So we've used funding to create housing to be used as childcare. So we're adding both housing and childcare into our community that will be there. We're not going to have a mortgage on it, so therefore we can offer lower rates to the daycare providers, which in turn will let them,
Yeah.
continue to operate longer term. And so I think there does have to be funding, but it's very specific to each community. Like you have to tailor it to the community that is and fit that community's needs. So
Yeah.
working across about 6 different counties in working together in collaboration, we've been able to bring in almost $3 million of childcare funding and create over 300, new slots. And you're talking, communities. I think we had a $2 million grant that covered 5 communities in 3 different counties. And then that expanded into 6 communities in 3 different counties. And then, we kept whittling the budget down because we are good stewards of the dollars. We want to make them go as long as possible. So then I think we ended up with 7 communities in 3 counties. And we kept adding, more daycare slots because we were able to tweak or leverage the funds that we had to obtain other funds. And then once your community sees that you're being successful, it's a lot easier conversation to have. So even though I don't have kids and I don't live in the counties that I work in, you can't whisper anything about daycare in those communities without me getting a phone call. Like it's just one of those things people know. If you have a child care question, go to, and it's just generally known. I have other counties call, and have helped other counties. So I think having that point of clear and concise information and knowing who's responsible for this has made a huge thing. Because before it was like, oh, I don't want to do it. I don't have time to do it. Well, that's not my thing. Well, I don't have,
How do I do that?
And so if you have somebody that's willing to tackle that, support them, because that has made the biggest difference in our area. And I've been able to open 4 new in-home daycares in the past 3 years and have supported our existing daycares while doing that. So because it doesn't make sense to create more slots if you're going to treat your other ones and lose them.
Yeah, just
So
let them go.
childcare as a whole, and my providers, instead of working against each other, we're so kumbaya-ish out there. I mean, they really support each other. They talk to each other. They share plans with each other. They all know what's going on with whose kids, because there's a lot of like, well, I don't want to pull, or I don't want to take kids if I know that there was an issue over here, whatever.
Pull from
But
somewhere else.
having good communication between the providers has really built a network of support within them. And then the substitutes on top of that, they just think, my daycare providers feel like they won the lottery, because they have,
We need to talk substitute.
they have not just, there's so much more above funding, but it's the support and the network and the feeling seen and heard that makes them feel like they enjoy what they're doing, not just, well, I'm making a lot of money, because they're not.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I do want to just be specific about the lines of funding we're talking about, because I think, you mentioned, Tamisha, after COVID, there was this deluge of federal funding that were coming to states that we were able to use to address early childhood. And I think that's what you both are talking about, were kind of those lines of funding. I think the Child Care Capacity Accelerator Grant. There's the Early Childhood Development Workforce Grant that was also there. But I do want to highlight this to the listeners that the state, the Kansas legislature, had been asked to continue funding these programs, which the Child Care Capacity Accelerator Grant built. So many centers and home programs across our state, and there were still over $60 million of unfunded projects across the state. So those are leaders like Tamisha and Julie who came together and who have been working in their community trying to build childcare in their town, but maybe just the one goalpost last barrier was just having the capital, because they're a rural community. Was to build that thing. And so I highlight that because, again, I'm so glad that we have leaders like you all to champion these causes, to champion the people in your community, but we also need champions for you. And we need people that when you let us know, like, hey, we've got this plan, we've got needs, and it's just stop being stopped by a dollar amount. And just to FYI, like, the legislature cut that funding because they saw it as a continuation of unneeded federal funding. Like, they thought we got that federal money and it was like, oh, we were just handing it out willy-nilly. And which I think if you listened to leaders that actually received that funding on the ground, they'll talk about being good stewards of that funding, how critical it was to building the capacity for the future. So I just want to highlight that.
And I was going to say too, as far as like being specific about the avenues of funding. I'll kind of go over how we did that. So we started out with the SBA loan when we were the LLC. And then one of the other major grants we received was the Accelerator Grant, of course. And then we also received the Early Childhood Block Grant, which is one that did require us to be nonprofit or to work with a nonprofit. So that's kind of part of the reason we did. And that has since, for the last few years, has been a big chunk of our funding is the Early Childhood Block Grant. So I know if funding for that went away, there would be a lot of providers that would be in need from, and I mean like big programs too, not just smaller ones like mine, but I mean like millions of dollars in facilities. Exactly. These big, huge programs that are a part of that. And then we did a lot of fundraising too, which is really hard and kind of a drain on people doing the fundraising as well as the people you're asking for as well. But so those have been the main three, and then there have just been some smaller grants. We actually received a grant from tribes in northeast Oklahoma because we do have some children who fall under I think there was like 3 different tribal areas, and they fell under that. So we actually received some funding from them in northeast Oklahoma as well. So shout out to them for helping a whole other state. And, just a few smaller grants here and there that were from, $10,000 grants here or there or wherever. And then, of course, most recently, we found out that this is after we opened and everything, that the long pipe that runs the entire length of our building, which is a pretty long building, has to be torn out and replaced. So that means tearing out the floor, the brand new floors, everything. It's going to cost over $80,000. And if we did not have the Patterson Family Foundation grant, I don't know what we would end up doing. We would be, because right now, basically, I guess this is getting into the nitty gritty of it, but our toilets would back up because stuff gets caught in that main pipe. And so we're having to pay $250 every time they come out and use a jet thing to wash it all out. So that's just adding up, and I don't know what we would do if we didn't have that grant funding. So, I mean, it's very important that we have that kind of funding available. Like, as much as everybody's like, oh, money won't solve every problem. Well, it'll sure solve a lot.
But it's also how you described many of those funding sources are inconsistent, and you don't know if you're going to get it.
Exactly.
And I think that trend extends across early childhood, is this idea of uncertainty.
Well, and going back to using them wisely, I started by asking our county commissioners for $9,000 to pay for a lease for 1 year. And I said, if we find a childcare provider, which I had one already in mind, that we will be paying rent, but then they will be paying us back. And so some of those funds came back to us, but not all of them, because we're subsidizing rent. And by receiving the accelerator grant from the Children's Cabinet, we're able to build, and then we do not have to ask our local taxpayers for additional funds. We've also received funding through Child Care Aware for some of their capacity building grants, and those have been helpful because they're not overly they're able to be managed by one person, because capacity is also an issue in these small towns, because I don't know how many
Grant
people.
management is a lot.
There's a lot of difference between independence
Oh, yeah.
and protection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're
So
around 9,000.
you're talking less than 500 people.
Yeah, exactly. Very different
in miles
situation.
and miles away from anything else.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have and know what funding is available and leverage your dollars the best you can.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that's why we're so grateful to have leaders like you. I know, because you can have the folks in early childhood, and I think that's one of the reasons I've also stayed in this work, is the feeling that there aren't enough people to support the people, that are doing it, and to find that avenue where you can be someone that can say, hey, especially with your entire approach, Julie, of helping regionally, and just when you see a need, in this idea of that you've been able to just be such an effective and responsible administrator of those tax dollars, and to create programs that were needed in the community. And
such creative ways.
oh yeah, and I think it's frustrating sometimes when it feels like we have so many leaders like you across the state, but we don't necessarily listen or think of how we can support you in that work. And so I think that's what's so exciting about as we kind of take this podcast out and start talking to more people, just like connecting to more of those leaders, where it's like, y'all, you're doing this work. What can we share out with the rest of the world about how they can help you and help champion you, since you're already a champion for our community?
And there's a lot of things that, not only just for the community, but actually for the state too. And that's where I think a lot of
Communities add up.
a lot of things, make a lot of sense. So I started economic development for a county that had not had economic development for a very long time and was not being funded. And I was like, I will pay for myself. And not pay for myself, but I was like, I will bring in more money than you will spend on my salary. I promise you that. And it was a joke for the first 4 months, and then I got my first grant, and I was already like, hey, I'm ahead, and I've never been behind. So just the importance of, economic development and the wide variety of things that they cover. But I've also had a very good board that supported me in all of my maybe out-of-the-box ideas, but they've all been successful. And I think that's where, the state recognized there's success here, and that's why I'm the only regional rural champion for the state of Kansas this year. And I'm already seeing the impact that has, and it'll be good to have those dollar numbers attached to. And success is not just merely based on dollar numbers, but it's something that's trackable. And to me, a success is, Wilmore population 27. Not only they got a grant to convert their old bank building into museum, but then I got them a grant for $200 for a sign, so people actually knew it was a museum and not a bank. And just little things like that are a win for me, and a win for a population of 27 people. But it goes so much bigger, and when you scale it and allow people that are doing the work, and you don't have to start from scratch. So now I'm teaching other people how to do what I do. And we're building capacity in Western Kansas in these places that need the most help and need funds, but don't want to ask the states if we work together and, can write some of these federal grants as a region. We're not pulling taxpayer dollars from our local people and from the state of Kansas, but we're still supporting these little bitty communities that, regardless of, whether they're incorporated or not, there's still going to be people living there that need water and sewer and some of these critical infrastructures. But Nashville, population 50, they don't have anybody or any dollars to replace their water lines, even though people are still going to live there forever, So how do we help themselves?
What is your message to Kansans who want to build and invest in the future of early childhood?
It's worth it, I would say. Not just worth it for today, but if we're going to continue to have these rural communities and the way of life that so many of us are accustomed to, it's got to be one of the top factors that we put in importance to a community.
Yeah, and I think I would echo that with it's definitely worth it. And kind of like you said, you would pay for yourself. It's an investment that will pay off in the future with early childhood education and for our communities and our state as a whole. And I think
It's important to remember
that childcare is infrastructure. We should treat it as such.
Well, I think of our state motto, ad astra per aspera, to the stars through difficulty. And I think if folks have been listening, you can hear a lot of difficulty in the space of early childhood in regards to how it's funded, what the workforce is going through, how this is not a new problem. It has been a generational trend, and I think it's just a problem that's coming to a head because of aging demographics, changes in the workforce. But yes, there's difficulty, but what are we aiming for? And I think when it comes to our children, when it comes to our families, when it comes to this idea of what we're trying to build for them, I think so much of what we could invest in should be tied to their success. And if we really centered children at the priority level of like every decision we make, how does this affect early childhood, our state would be a much better place. And I think there's so many policymakers that agree with those values, they align with them, and it can be challenging because, to your point, Julie, sometimes we can have these values around caring about children and wanting to have quality care, but what's the idea? What are we specifically asking for? And I think we can look to so many states across the country that are creating separate lines of revenue to generate funding for early childhood. We have not done that in Kansas. We have been coasting off of tobacco settlement dollars since 2000. And great, that's amazing that we allocate all that to early childhood, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what our needs are, how if we want to lead the nation, which I think as Kansans we aspire to lead the nation. I think a lot of folks outside of Kansas are surprised by our aspirational entrepreneurship and how hard we are willing to work for each other. So I just want this to be our rallying cry. I think as policymakers, stop looking at this as a challenge and start looking at it as an opportunity, because not only could we address a crisis, we could build something that is so aligned with what we care about, that is so welcoming to, it's corny as it is, I feel like it ties into the Seldom is Heard name. Like, what does your home on the range look like? What is that idea in your mind for your children? And how can we aspire to that? And what do we need to do from a policy level to a funding level to make that happen? So that'd be my message.
Yeah. And I guess my message is that there are people working on it, right? Like, this is not a Herculean task. You are not Sisyphus. You don't have to roll this thing up the hill, back down the hill. Like, you're not alone, right? And Kansas is really big, and it can feel like it's just you, but it's a lot of people out in the state who all care and who are all making a difference. And I think that's the best way you solve this. Like, group of people making a difference makes a worthwhile change.
Yes. And I think it's, to add to your point, Pempo, folks should join Zero to Thrive and our advocacy work, because again, if you share our values, we create power when we are organized around our values. right? Because like, you can have your own individual thing you care about, but that's often when we feel the most powerless, is when we keep our values to ourselves and then think about how we could change the world. But to your point, if we find community, which there is within us and across the state, I mean, I mentioned that sign-on letter that we had circulated. We had representation from all 105 counties. That was a lot of phone calls, y'all. But guess what? It was easy because we were talking about something that people love. Like when you talk about this issue and you talk about the opportunity it presents, man, do you see the depoliticking go on? Like, I mean, it's really just becomes completely nonpartisan when you start to actually talk about the substance of everything. So, yes, join us, y'all.
Well, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Tamisha. This has been fantastic.